All right, welcome back, everybody, to Project Move. Today, we're going to kind of talk about the Centenarian Decathlon and kind of this whole longevity and setting ourselves up to live a happy, healthier lifestyle well into our golden years and not just kind of wasting away in a nursing home. So, the kind of idea is that life isn't just a marathon, it's a sprint, it's a hurdle, it's a max effort deadlift.
Yep, we need to be well rounded. We can't just focus on one of those things.
Yeah, so and the kind of idea is we want it's kind of like almost like we plan for retirement, how we want to start investing and diversifying early. We want to kind of take that same mindset to our health and longevity.
Right? Yeah. So I think there's a Japanese saying that they asked, "When's the best time to plant a tree?" It was 10 years ago. When's the next best time? It's right now. So we need to be looking forward to like what we want to do, or even ask ourselves, what do you want to be able to do in your last 10 years of life? Because we call this the Centenarian Decathlon, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're trying to live to 100. It just means that in our last 10 years, we want to try to live the best life possible. And so, what do we need to do now to prepare ourselves to be able to live high quality years towards the end?
Yeah, and it's not just doing one thing. It's like if you are a runner, well, we still need to uh, increase bone density. We still need to strengthen our connective tissue. So it's kind of more of a everything that's kind of required for aging well.
Yeah, I mean, if you really break it down into all the details, it can look daunting on paper, right? Because it's like, oh, we've got to do strength training, we've got to do endurance training, we've got to do connective tissue training, we've got to do all these different things. We got to sleep well, we got to eat well, we've got to, there's so much. But I think that once we kind of break it down, we can kind of make it a bit more digestible and make it a little bit more kind of approachable, if you will.
Yeah, so I mean, I know statistics show that kind of well, maybe not till recently, but like our lifespans are increasing,
Yes.
but the quality of our life has actually kind of been decreasing.
Yeah. So if you look at, medicine as a whole, obviously we've had tremendous advancements over the course of the last, say 100 years, but we're really good at acute, you know, trauma, those types of things, but the chronic disease hasn't really budged that much. But we can keep people living longer by kind of like patching them up a little bit.
Putting a
But it,
band-aid on it.
yeah, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're living high quality years as they kind of start to age.
Yeah, and I can almost argue that it's actually kind of gotten worse.
Yeah, the data would suggest that the last 5 years we are seeing actually a decline in the lifespan. So that would hold true.
Yeah, so lifespan going up, but health span.
Yeah, so there's a graph, and we might be able to put this either in the show notes or maybe splice it in somewhere. But basically, it shows that lifespan is actually staying pretty high, but we see this like actual pretty severe drop off after a particular amount of time. That there's this huge gap or discrepancy between quality of life and actually years lived.
What do you think is kind of like contributing to that?
This is kind of a deep ball of wax. I mean,
Well, let's go.
I think there's a lot of factors. Clearly, people are more sedentary. That's one thing. Clearly, we have a lot of cheap processed foods. I think that's contributing. But I really think our artificial environments that we put ourselves in is an underlying contributor that kind of spans across all domains. So it's not just poor food, it's not just a lack of exercise, but 92% of people live indoors that hardly ever get outside in nature. And it doesn't mean that hunter gatherers are living super long, but the goal is we need to kind of break free from our artificial lifestyles.
Yeah, maybe let's kind of look more to that. So yeah, technology's been advancing, which has kind of been a lot more conducive for kind of staying more indoors, becoming more sedentary. I guess, yeah, I think it's all kind of contributing to, and then also uh, cheaper, more processed foods. It's
Yep.
kind of all compounding. But let's maybe kind of break that apart kind of one by one. Let's go more into this kind of artificial. I don't know if we were planning this, but like maybe, yeah, let's maybe talk a little bit about this artificial environments.
Yeah. So I mean, if you really think about it, blue light from our devices, that's really a negative, health contributor, if you will. So there's research shown that the presence of the blue light, specifically from phones or computers, raises blood glucose. So whenever we start talking about metabolic health and diabetes and poor, glucose regulation, insulin sensitivity, we actually can get spikes in blood glucose just from being around technology without even ingesting carbohydrates. So the contribution of poor metabolic health isn't just from people making poor food choices, it's really from the fact that they're bathing in this negative blue light environment, and it's all around us. And then in addition to the blue light, we have all this non-native EMF. So we have Wi-Fi routers, we have 5G towers, we have all this stuff contributing, even just the electronics of like our air conditioner, the wiring, like all has a negative effect. Um, Different effects for different people. Some people are a little bit more tolerant than others, but it's, even if you say you don't feel it, and even if you say, oh, well, I can't tell a difference, there is a calculable effect, even if you're unaware of it.
Yeah, and we're going to go into in a later episode more details on this.
Yeah, I think that it deserves its own episode, but whenever we, like, this episode is really more framing around the exercise component, and how exercise contributes to improved health, or a lack of exercise, contributes to a lack of health. So I think that framing this, like, we know that there are all these other things involved, but from our particular backgrounds, kind of from the performance side or the exercise side, we're going to kind of tailor this a little bit more towards like how exercise, is beneficial. Everyone knows that exercise is beneficial, or at least has some idea that exercise is beneficial, but I don't think it's as well understood of all the different aspects of exercise, because I think people fall into the trap of, oh, well, I go to the gym 3 times a week, I'm good, right? But it's like, what are you doing at the gym? And, we could look at two different people on both on a treadmill. One's actually putting in really good quality work. The other one is on the treadmill. They're watching the news or they're watching a TV show. And it's like they both were at the gym for an hour doing cardio, but one actually was getting calculable benefits. The other one was just burning calories.
Yeah.
So,
well said. Yeah. So yeah, today we're really going to kind of look at this through a more exercise lens, but we do kind of want to touch briefly on some of these other contributing factors.
yeah.
Okay, so we have this artificial environment. We have this poor nutrition, which is huge. I mean, we buy our food at a grocery store now. We have a lot of these ultra processed foods,
Right.
Which is contributing to spiking glucose levels, and then therefore just kind of overall creating a little bit more insulin resistance.
Correct. Yeah. And so, again, not to trail too far off, but there was some recent research done not that long ago, a few years ago, that if you spend 15 minutes outside before you eat your meal, it lowers your glucose response by 30%. It's like 27%. So a simple little like hack, if you will, is spend a little time outside before you eat your meal, and you can actually decrease the spike in glucose after a meal.
I hadn't heard that one. I did hear the taking a walk after you eat, which also then.
Well, then that's from both a light perspective and a movement perspective, you're getting the benefits. So yeah, there's a compound effect if you would do both.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So then this kind of like creating this more insulin we're living in a world that's kind of creating this more insulin resistance,
Yep.
but along comes with that is this more inflammation.
Yeah. So if you're spiking glucose, whether it be from tech devices, even though you're not aware of it, or whether it be from poor food choices, you basically are setting yourself up for low grade chronic inflammation. And that can result in joint pain, muscular pain, brain fog, like you name it. Like there's a whole whole host of symptoms that we could basically contribute to this inflammation.
Yeah, I think more and more science is coming out showing that like inflammation is kind of just leading to this very uh, broad spectrum to like chronic disease. And now we even say now that dementia is like type 3 diabetes.
Correct. Yeah. And so poor glucose management um, is clearly the contributor. So, the one thing that have you read the book Burn by Herman Ponzer?
I have not.
Okay, so he gets into the evolutionary biology of like nutrition and how we can't exercise our way out of a bad diet.
I've heard that.
So, people think that, oh, I'm going to the gym, I'm going to run on the treadmill, and I'm going to burn calories. Um, but his research shows that hunter gatherers, he actually went and studied the Hadza, the Maasai, and some different groups that are still considered hunter gatherers. And he found that while our calorie burn is almost similar or identical, like they're in a completely different environment. And so their their metabolic health is completely different than a standard American. But long story short, you can't run on a treadmill long enough to contribute to basically negative calories. There's always going to be this like new set point. So, people that start to work out a lot more, they start to get hungrier, right? And so there's going to be this offset of I burnt 200 calories, but then I'm going to want to eat 200 more calories. And so there's always this fluctuation of I burn more, I eat more. And so you could starve yourself and you could try to like make that gap bigger, but eventually the set point just like, okay, if you're going to starve yourself, you basically you start to limit output. And so you can't really exercise your way to like lower or thinner waistline.
Yeah. Uh, so yeah, nutrition obviously played a big role. I think we'll definitely go into a much more detailed discussion on that.
Yep. Oh, another one. You can't exercise your way out of poor sleep either. So
That's it. You took the words right out of my mouth. Sleep.
so again, we did an episode on sleep. I think we could probably do a follow-up episode. There's some more to talk about that. But if you're getting 4 hours of sleep a night, it doesn't matter how good your nutrition is. It doesn't matter what you're doing in the gym, your recovery, your hormonal profiles. Like you're never going to like. I mean, in the short term, you can get away with it, but in the long term, if we're looking at like global scales of lifetime, you can't get away with poor sleep over long periods of time.
Yeah, sleep's kind of like just the global reset to bringing kind of everything back to
Yeah, whenever we're
homeostasis.
whenever we're talking about recovery, like sleep is the best recovery tool that we have. And so there are all these like different protocols of like trying to optimize for better sleep, and that's definitely something to strive for. But interestingly enough, like what you do during the day and what you expose yourself to influences how like your body is preparing to sleep. So you know too much artificial light at night, which we talked about in our light episode, um, that's going to contribute to a lack of melatonin release, which will basically kind of time shift our sleep schedule to where we don't want to fall asleep until 2 or 3 hours later. And so it contributes to not falling asleep whenever we should. And so again, it kind of blunts that recovery and is going to limit our progress as far as how well we are whenever we're recovering and that sort of thing.
So yeah, I kind of want to talk next on like so this decline in metabolic health and all
Yep.
these factors kind of contributing to it.
Yep.
It only kind of comes down to I guess like poor mitochondrial function.
Yeah. And so again, we're going to talk about a little later the effects of exercise on the mitochondria, but really, again, this could be a whole nother episode. The light environment dictates because mitochondria are really environmental sensors for our light environment. And so the mitochondria are sensing the light that we're in, and their function is directly dictated by our surroundings. So, poor metabolic health, yes. Are we clogging our system with processed foods? Yes. Are we not sleeping well? Yes. Are we maybe not exercising, not necessarily correctly, but in the ways that we need to? Probably. But the light environment is another factor that plays into this poor metabolic health and or mitochondrial health. So whenever we take this kind of comprehensive like overview, if you don't get your light environment right, doesn't matter, again, all of these other factors, you're still never going to get to that point that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and just to kind of cover. So metabolic health is kind of talking about how we use our energy, and
Yep.
then the mitochondria is kind of what actually kind of creates energy inside our cells.
Yeah. So if you think of food, food is bringing in a source of energy, and then the mitochondria basically have to take that energy in one form, transform it into usable forms that are tissues and or cells. So it's kind of like the converter. And so if you're taking poor quality food and it's trying to convert poor quality food, well, you could think of putting, like, if you had a Ferrari and you bought the Ferrari today, you could put terrible gas in it and it would still run 225 just fine. But over time, you're going to gunk up the engine, and eventually it's going to start to not perform the as well as we would like. You're going to have to take it in. You're going to have to get it tuned up. Well, our mitochondria are really kind of like the engine, if you will. And so junk in, you're going to get basically junk out. So
We don't want to put 87 low octane
yeah,
fuel inside a
you want
Ferrari.
the racing fuel, if you will, or whatever the engine's designed for. And so, but part of the fuel, if you will, is the light. So the activation of the mitochondria really starts with the light signature. It takes the light signature and then basically converts that into more of a chemical. And so if you don't get the light right, the food part is always going to be a problem as well.
Yeah, and we're going to go into a lot more. Josh is actually going to go into a lot more detail
Yeah.
on light in a later episode. But kind of getting back to, okay, so looking at this through this more of an exercise lens, and kind of let's actually stick on this car analogy, kind of getting back to things we can do from an exercise standpoint of how to increase our metabolic health and improve our mitochondrial health. And then kind of, yeah, a good analogy is kind of like thinking of things like we've got this zone 2 training and we've got kind of VO2 max. And kind of the idea is like our zone 2 is going to be kind of more fuel efficiency. It's kind of like being in a hybrid type of car, more eco mode.
Yep.
Kind of also having like a bigger gas tank, being able to store more fuel. Whereas your VO2 max is going to be more like shifting into sport mode, where we're kind of focusing kind of more on like top speed and performance.
Yeah, so that zone 2, or that lower intensity, but it's actually higher intensity than some people probably realize. So there's the talk test, and so you should be able to say a few words, but you shouldn't necessarily be able to have like a full-on conversation. So if it's like 2 or 3 words and then you need a little bit of a pause, another 2 or 3, maybe 5 words. Anyway, so that's like a really easy way to determine if you're in zone. Like if we just went for a walk and we're able to have a full-on conversation, we're probably in zone 1. But if we're maybe at a slight jog or we're going up a hill, and we don't really want to have that, full on sentence. We're probably getting closer to that zone 2. Um, if you really want to know if you're in zone 2 or not, you really have to do a lactate test. And so there's a very particular millimole of lactate, it's like 2, where that's like the threshold of where we're able to buffer the lactate and we're not overproducing lactate. But that's maybe a little bit more for the nerds out there that really want to get into a deep dive on actually zone 2 or not,
Yeah.
And then obviously VO2. So VO2, that's like our top end speed. So if you just imagine if you needed to sprint across a street to, save someone from getting run over by a car, like that's like your ability to have a burst of speed. So that's more of like that high performance aspect.
Yeah, so let's kind of maybe look at this, focus a little bit more on some zone 2, really trying to improve, because that's when it's really going to improve, give us the most benefit as far as improving mitochondrial health and metabolic function.
Yeah, so think of, the zone 2, we can almost think about as like trying to stave off fatigue. So you want to be able to go for, long durations. So if we're getting into like a zone 2 training session,
Hold on, so first, before, I don't want to start to interject.
Yeah.
So we have 3 different energy pathways. We have our phosphocreatine system, which is going to be real short duration,
right,
10 seconds. Then we kind of then tap into our anaerobic, which we're kind of more burning more glucose for fuel. And then finally, then we'll tap into aerobic respiration, where we're kind of then now burning more fat for fuel.
Correct.
And in that fat burn zone is kind of like that zone 2, where pretty much all the calories you're going to be burning is going to be kind of coming from that from more aerobic respiration.
Yeah, and so if you do like a resting energy expenditure test, and then you can do another kind of test where while you're on the treadmill they can see like where you're at as far, and so there's a particular number that will tell you if you're in basically the fat burning zone versus a carbohydrate burning zone. So there are specific tests that can be done to help you kind of guide where you need to be as far as like heart rate, so that you can kind of do this on your own. But there are some kind of free tests that you could do, kind of like we said, the talk tests, those types of things, where it's a good estimate. If you want to get into the nitty gritty, there are places that you can go get these tests done to kind of.
And then, yeah, even kind of just using your everyday heart rate monitor is going to be helpful as well.
Yeah, because there's different estimates of, using your heart rate max and then doing like 80%, and then kind of coming up with a rough heart rate number that would kind of put you in a pretty good zone.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously we're going to improve mitochondrial function, and how does that kind of fit into improving our metabolic health and like fighting off chronic disease and like dementia?
Yeah, so the human body, like we store the most mitochondria in our brain, in our heart. And we didn't really talk about this yet, but there's basically the 4 horsemen of disease. So we have cardiovascular disease, we have neurodegenerative disease, we have metabolic disease, and then what's the 4th one?
Cancer.
Yeah. So the funny thing is, if we took all 4 of those, the mitochondria are really like at the root of all 4 of those. So the poorer the quality of the mitochondria, the less likely we're going to have success in those areas, or we're going to have higher rates of mitochondrial dysfunction, which is eventually going to lead to potential heart attacks, potential cancer development, neurodegenerative problems, those are obviously diabetes, those types of things. So it really comes down to energy management and how we're able to, manage the energy coming in and then manage the output of the energy.
Yeah. Okay, so let's maybe talk a little bit about how do we go about training, like getting in the zone two. How long do we need to go for, uh, and frequency? How often?
Yeah, so the zone two, 45 minutes would probably be about the minimum time frame, like per training session. So if you think about like what you talked about with the different energy systems, so we almost have to, even though it's not linear, it's not like phosphocreatine, glycolytic, anaerobic, like it doesn't work in sections. They're all happening at the same time, but there is a bit of a time frame. It takes that 10 to 15 minutes to kind of push yourself into that more anaerobic state. So you really have to do a 15-minute kind of warm up just to kind of get your system into the right energy system.
Yeah.
And then once you're in that energy system, now you need basically what they call steady state, and you need to be able to stay in that zone for a particular
Yeah. So
amount of
it
time.
may take us 10, 15 minutes to kind of get into that aerobic zone.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to really improve on it, we have to stress that system for a period of time. So that's where that 45-minute kind of duration comes in.
Yep. As you get better or more efficient, you probably would need to stretch that out to closer to an hour. I mean, obviously time constraints, but here's the thing. So you would be much better off doing 2 45-minute sessions per week rather than trying to do, you know, 3 or 4 30-minute sessions, because the problem is the time. So the physiology only works a particular way. So you can't hack the physiology in a way that you get yourself into that zone quicker. I mean, yes, efficiency will shorten it, but you can't just jump into zone
No,
two.
that makes sense.
And so because of that, there is a time constraint. So the duration is important. So, at minimum, you probably should be looking at 2 45-minute sessions per week in this targeted zone two, range.
Yeah, and it's depending on whether what your goals are. So if you're just looking for more longevity, yes, we want to get that minimum 2 times a week. But if you're an endurance athlete, obviously you're going to need to spend way more than 45 minutes.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And then that we kind of like jumped ahead a bit, but I think that so we talked about this centenarian decathlon. So what do you want to be able to do in your last 10 years of life? And so we could come up with a list, and so everyone's list is going to be a little different. Just say you like to travel, you want to be able to put a suitcase in an overhead bin in your 80s. Well, typical suitcase is going to be 35-ish pounds, depending. So you need to be able to pick up a 35-pound suitcase, put it in an overhead bin. So that requires a certain amount of strength, a certain amount of power to get it up off the ground, certain amount of range of motion. So things that for us right now would be a piece of cake that we could do blindfolded, all day. But at 80, it's going to be a little bit more challenging. So if you want to be able to play pickleball at 80, it doesn't matter. You come up with your list, but I think so. So here's the interesting thing. So in high school, in college, or just if you're a recreational athlete, CrossFit athlete, you might have specific goals that you're trying to achieve. I want to be able to get to this particular, and then once you retire, or you don't really have specific goals anymore, and then it's just, oh, I want to be healthy. Well, healthy could be a lot of different things. So this gives us a little bit more of a parameter to shoot for, to allow us to have a little bit more of a framework of how we're going to structure our exercise to be able to strive for these particular, goals.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think retirement. It's like, oh, I'm done now. I've kind of,
Yes.
and now I can just kind of sit back and relax, and just kind of just enjoy the rest of my life. But when you do that, I think one of the things we kind of recently learned is how, in the most recent years, is how plastic the brain is. So
Hmm.
the ability to create change and adapt is probably one of our greatest strengths, but also can be like a great weakness in the sense that, like, if from looking at it from a retirement standpoint, just trying to sit back and relax, we're then just getting where we have prior before we've allocated resources to daily movements, doing certain tasks, and then when we eventually just kind of just stop and don't do anything, our brain goes the opposite way, and we're going to end up kind of losing kind of what we had.
Yeah. So, several years ago, we just assumed that there was a cap on our ability to create change. But as we figured out that that is the furthest from the truth. So, I know there's people that might, ask the question, is it too late? If you're breathing, it's never too late. So we might not be able to make specific or certain changes, but there's always room for improvement, no matter what your age or um, structural dysfunction may be. Like, so there's always room for improvement. So having said that, this retirement, so you have this daily, you're doing your job or whatever. Well, as soon as you retire, it's like you've got to now figure out how to allocate your time, whether it be, you know, going to the gym or like doing, like, you've got to create some sort of movement routine, um, you know, engaging with people. Cause, if you retire and you no longer are seeing like big groups of people anymore, like your social engagements, like that's a thing that mental health kind of component. So keeping the brain engaged, whether it be through, physical connection or exercise, like, are are going to stimulate those capacities to keep the brain growing in a positive direction rather than atrophying with basically a lack of
Yeah, I
participation.
think we all probably could know somebody or have heard of somebody as soon as they retire, like it's like their health just immediately went
Yeah,
downhill.
and you'll start to see increases in cancer potentially, or increases in heart problems. That's where they start to gain a bunch of weight, metabolic health. So they're all those, four things that we talked about earlier. Whenever you stop moving or stop doing as much, that's whenever it's almost like you had the ability to kind of like push it aside for a while, but then as soon as you start making less movement, maybe poor sleeping, you're staying up late at night now, you're eating poor food choices, that's whenever this like chronic disease starts to really kind of creep in, and you start to lose function, on top of that.
Yeah. Okay. Kind of bring us back to the zone two
Mm-hmm.
and improving vital. From a performance standpoint, uh, it's kind of like I said, it's kind of like our gas tank. So if we're looking at this from more of a performance lens, we only have so much energy we can put into our training.
Yes.
So this is
Definitely.
why zone two is so important. Essentially, it's going to give us a bigger gas tank so that we can spend maybe more time, uh, yeah, training and tackling different areas of our strength goals. If you're a marathon runner, long distance.
Mm-hmm. Or even, if you're now more on the aging side of things, like just the ability, not to get winded whenever you go up a flight of stairs. Like, if that's the case, clearly there's some decline happening. And so, if you're walking in the park with your grandkids or going to the zoo, and like, if you've got to stop and take a bunch of breaks, that's going to impact the quality of the enjoyment, if you will. So, having the ability to maintain energy output over a longer period of time, like, that's the capacity that we're training this endurance piece, if you will.
Yeah. Uh, okay, you kind of mentioned the kind of staircase that kind of made me think about, and hopefully we're not missing anything on zone two, but we need to have some sort of baseline, or maybe look at the ceiling in order to be able to do certain tasks. So this kind of brings us to this next important section on like your VO2 max, and
Mm-hmm.
we have to have like a certain capacity in order to be able to do certain things. So like in order to be able to climb the stairs, we have to have a certain power output in order to be able to do certain tasks.
Yeah, and so there's this it's called METs, or metabolic equivalence, and so it basically looks at, I mean, there's textbooks that have endless lists. You can find them if you Google them. But basically, every activity is going to have this metabolic demand, if you will. And so you need a specific level of cardiovascular output to be able to do the task basically efficiently. And so, you know, as we age, there's this decline that's potentially happening. And so our goal is to kind of minimize that decline and try to keep it as flatlined as possible rather than this like sharp decline. So if we're trying to project of like what do we need whenever we're 80, well, if we're 50 or 40 or 30, it has to be higher because there's always going to be this negative slope, if you will. So if we know that to climb a flight of stairs, it requires a particular VO2, let's just say 20. Okay, so if you're 40, to be able to maintain a VO2 of 20, you need a VO2 of just say 50. And so it's like, we know that there's going to be a decline. So the rate of decline we're trying to like minimize, but we know it's going to happen no matter what. So we have to be starting, and the younger you are, the higher you need to start, because you're going to fall to a certain level. So it's like you don't want to fall below that, because as soon as you fall below that, now the flight of stairs is going to seem like super difficult, or just moving around is now going to feel like a real chore, whereas we're trying to make this be as easy as possible, right?
Yeah, because whatever activity we're doing, or we could look at it as maybe even stress. It's basically VO2 max is how much oxygen our body's able to use in that given amount of time. So the more oxygen we can use, the more higher stressful things we're capable of doing.
Yeah, and so like if you look at a marathon runner, to be successful, you need a particular VO2, you need a particular lactate threshold, like all of these things that come into play. And so if we look at Lance Armstrong, his VO2 might not have been the highest, but his lactate threshold was like ridiculously high. So he was able to really utilize all that he had. And so there were people that had higher VO2s, but he still outperformed them, aside from maybe the performance enhancing drugs.
I was gonna say that, but then we come to find out that everybody was on it.
Exactly. So like there was really like people want to say that there wasn't an even playing field. Relatively, it was. So like his performance still was better than everyone else. You can't convince me otherwise. So anyway, long story short, the VO2 number, and that's an interesting thing to think about. So we talked about the person who goes to the gym and they spend an hour doing cardio, right? One person is kind of lackadaisical and they're just kind of going through the motions. The other person has a very specific intent behind what they're doing. But if we asked each person, oh, I did my hour of cardio today. Well, if we flip the kind of narrative, if you will, and we just looked at the output, and so, okay, this person has a 30 VO2 and this one has a 50. Well, the person that has a 50 VO2 is going to be able to perform more things. And so that would be the metric of like looking at like what the output winds up being, rather than just did you achieve time in zone 2 or time in the VO2 max session.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk maybe a little bit about that, like VO2 max. So how do we train the system?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to look at it is it's like a version of interval training, but maybe not exactly what you think. So longer duration intervals, so closer to like 4 minutes. So you want to basically,
This is like optimization. Not saying you can't get it in shorter intervals, but
yeah. If we're looking to improve VO2, this 4 minute interval kind of winds up being kind of what we're shooting for. And so we want to be able to go for 4 minutes almost kind of as hard as you can sustain for that 4 minute period. And then you're basically going to take 4 minutes and rest. And so, we can be looking at this from a heart rate perspective. We can be looking at this from, a watts perspective if we're on a bike. Um, we can kind of quantify it in different ways, but really it's like a 4 minute high intensity portion, a 4 minute kind of rest recovery, and then we want to cycle through these at least 4 times. So with your warm up, with your kind of intervals, with your cool down, you're looking at about an hour's worth of time training. Um, but those intervals are where we're really trying to like focus on.
yeah. Uh, Frequency. How often? So I think maybe some people have heard of this. I think I've heard of like that kind of that 80-20 rule. So most of our training should be kind of spent in that zone two, trying to improve mitochondria function,
Yep.
and then that other 20% is going to be trying to raise that ceiling.
Correct. Yeah. So, for the average person, if you're not training for a particular aerobic event, you only need one time a week. Um, like you're just trying to keep testing the system, if you will, and you're trying to touch that max output, but you don't need to continually be getting into that particular zone.
Kind of reminds me of our last episode talking about sport specific training, and depending on what our sport is, we may only need to hit those max effort lifts like once every 2 weeks, depending on what the sport is,
Yeah.
depending on what your sport demands. Same thing with our cardiovascular health.
Right.
Yeah, it really depends on what your goals are, but yeah, kind of at a minimum for
Yeah. And
longevity, kind of that one time a week.
so again, the goals drive the training. So we're talking about this from a general perspective, um, but you've got to have time, like we talked about. You have limited resources, you have limited time. So like if you're doing too many VO2 sessions in a week, well, now you're pulling away from other things that you could be doing.
Oh, CrossFit's guilty. Is that like my ability? It's so hard for me to spend time in zone two. Like I just almost immediately get kicked out.
Right.
And get put into like zone four.
Yeah.
And that's pretty common. But it's kind of what you're used to training in your metcons. It's kind of like more that high intensity intervals.
Right. And that's where places like Orange Theory and different, like they're kind of in that same almost like zone four-ish type. So you know um, getting back to that 80-20 rule, so it's like most, even like elite sprinters, they don't spend all their time sprinting.
Yeah.
Like they're working on mechanics and they're working on that aerobic efficiency, and then they're only putting that max effort into the very specific things that they need to help get them to higher performance. So a sprinter isn't spending all their time sprinting. So I think it's a bit of a like misnomer thinking that like, oh, we need to be doing like all this high intensity stuff. It's fun, people enjoy it. I know people can get bored with some of the lower intensity because they feel like they're not doing anything. But that's where get a friend, help with some motivation in a community type sense versus just kind of if you like doing it on your own, that's fine. But there's ways of kind of creating motivation in maybe other ways.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. So I think most important so far, improving metabolic health, improving mitochondrial function.
Mm-hmm.
Making sure we're getting that in. Also, making sure we have a high enough ceiling to be able to do these certain, it's like, it's from a longevity standpoint, be able to climb that flight of stairs, be able to, you know, get off the floor, play with our grandkids.
Yeah, and those aren't specific to any particular person or athlete. It's really everyone. Um, and this goes back to what are the needs, because just say you're a lifelong endurance athlete. You love marathons, you love endurance events. um, if you look at all of these domains that we're talking about, and you're already an 8 out of 10, a 9 out of 10, or maybe even a 10 out of a 10, like as far as like elite endurance runner, your time, you might need to take a little bit of that time that you're spending in that endurance zone and maybe putting it in one of these other domains. Or if you're a strength athlete, which we're going to talk about here soon, like if you're if you love training with weights, but you've never really done any endurance training, your stamina and your ability to recover actually would improve if you just took a little bit of that training volume and you decreased it and you put it in some other training modality.
Yeah. I think we mentioned before, it's like when you're, I mean, this is, the more you come back to it, it's like the more balance, the more balance you need. Yes, you can be a little bit more specific in a specific sport or specific uh, area of fitness, but making sure you're getting your base on it each just will help kind of keep the system performing.
Yeah, and
better.
you could take that balance and kind of really apply it in multiple domains. So, if you think of running is basically the definition of a patterned exercise, right? You're constantly doing the exact same thing over and over. So part of the training is to try to almost de-patternize to a certain extent. And then, if we think of gym exercises, they're all patterns. And then so we can even extrapolate that to another level of trying to get ourselves into even more variability. So this multi-dimension, more variability in the system, the better, right? So we need to be good at a lot of different things.
Because life's not a sprint. If life's not just a sprint, it's not just a marathon. It's everything.
So like, if you think of humans in general, we're the ultimate like generalist, if you will. We have the ability to be specific, but really our nature is being like, not necessarily great at everything, but we're doing all of these different things. And so if we get too specialized, which we did talk about last time, like that's where we can start to really see like problems start to really arise.
Yeah. Okay, so let's kind of move forward. So kind of talked about this improving mitochondria health and energy production. Can also want to talk on kind of like from a longevity standpoint, like maintaining strength as we're older, and kind of look at it three different things. Like we want to be able to, and we'll go into more detail, like prevent ourselves from going to the ground because what's that statistic? It's like if you break your hip, we were just talking about this the other day. If you break your hip over the age of 50 and then over the age of 60, the likelihood of, I guess, more death.
Yeah, you have a 30, like if you're over the age of 50 and you break your hip, your 1 year mortality, so basically within the next year, you have a 30% risk of dying. And it's like, you don't think of a 50-year-old, like,
yeah, that's crazy.
It's actually really high. Like you think, well, 30%, okay, well, you have 70%, but it's like, no, that is ridiculously. And then the older you are, like it starts to really like shrink. So like if you're over the age of 70, it's it's over 50%. It's almost upwards of 60%. So like your year mortality, like you could die within the next year. And that's so we want to prevent that as much as possible, right? So having strength, um, obviously endurance and all that, but really, if we look at hip fractures, it's really that muscular strength component that helps minimize, because we were talking about the hip joint itself. So you have the head of the femur, you have the neck of the femur, and then like the shaft going down to the knee, because it's not necessarily a straight bone. It has a little bit of a curve to it. So hip fractures tend to kind of occur right at a kind of specific zone, and there's kind of a natural inherent like weak point. And so if the musculature that supports the lateral aspect of the hip doesn't have the ability to maintain force production, we start to see that the neck of the femur starts to bend. And if you think of it, it's like a paperclip. If we start to bend a paperclip like one or two times, it's fine. But if you keep doing it over and over, eventually the paperclip breaks. So what we see is that the hip fractures, and because of the fracture of the hip, then the person falls. So it's actually the force production of the hip decreases to the point where they can't support the weight of the body. The femur then loses its ability to resist, because we don't realize that it's the stiffening of the muscles that actually keeps the bone like healthy. Whereas under no load, the bones do have a little bit more give to them than like almost like a golf shaft. We think of a driver shaft. It's relatively stiff, but we can put a little flex into it. So a bone's the same way. We can actually put, so if the stiffness of the musculature isn't there to balance out those forces, then we start to see this excess force going through the bone. Over time, it almost delaminates to the point where it fractures. We see these falls. And so we blame the fall on the fracture, but it's actually a lot of times in reverse.
And we can strengthen, I guess, our bones through load bearing.
100%. Yes. So Wolff's Law states that if you put a mechanical force through the bone is going to respond and create this remodeling or like density. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like they did the study. Do you remember that study? I'm sure you have, where they put an astronaut in space, and as soon as they drew blood, what did they find immediately in their bloodstream? More calcium.
Yeah. So
because when you're in space, there's no gravity, you're not load bearing, and your body doesn't need that extra calcium, so it just dumps it into the bloodstream.
Yeah. And so again, we've talked about this numerous times, but the body is trying to optimize for efficiency. So if there's a path of least resistance, the body is going to choose that. And so we don't need bone density. So to maintain bone density, that's a metabolic demand. So that just gets right back into all of those mitochondria conversations that we had. So deep down, mitochondrial dysfunction is the root of osteoporosis, or the root of bone health, if you will. So as soon as you leave Earth's gravitational field, you don't have that mechanical stress to the bones anymore. The body says we don't need calcium to maintain that stiffness.
So it's basically like, because you're not load bearing, the mitochondria health of that particular system doesn't need to be there. So mitochondrial health.
Yeah. So the energy it takes for the mitochondria to maintain the health of the bone, it's like, well, we can use that energy elsewhere. And so because the mitochondria aren't maintaining that, then it's like, okay, well, let's just get rid of it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's kind of back to this kind of preventing falls. Prevent ourselves from going to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
First, we need to maintain joint health. We've mentioned that several times. Probably nauseating, but also trying to absorb force, trying to this idea of putting on the brakes, preventing ourselves from going to the ground. How do we put on the brakes better? Well, we need force absorbing tissue, and that kind of brings us back to that connective tissue.
Yeah, so connective tissue is kind of the name of the game. Again, I think we've talked about this several different times, but that's probably one of the least trained aspects of the body. Um, and people just assume you're training the muscles, you're also training the connective tissue because the connective tissue surrounds the muscle or connects the muscle to the bone. But there are specific ways that we can train the connective tissue. So we need to use that, or we need to have that as part of our training. It can't just be an afterthought.
Yeah, and kind of reiterate as we mentioned before in one of the first two episodes. How do we train connective tissue?
Mm-hmm.
Training at length, so
Correct.
Long isometric holds.
Yep.
Also going to length,
right.
So more eccentric, so kind of putting on the brakes, and then going to length with velocity.
Yeah, so
maybe not necessarily the most important for longevity, but definitely putting on the brakes, really kind of working on slowing our descent, trying to essentially, slow how fast we're falling to the ground. Because the faster we're falling to the ground, the more likely we are to break something.
Yeah, so if you think of like some sort of gymnast, and they're doing some trapeze act or like parallel bars, whatever, and they've got this big old cushion mat. Well, what does the mat, like, why does the mat prevent like a catastrophic injury? So if you think of it, as the mat compresses, it slows the rate of acceleration. So if you have the ability for the connective tissue to load at length, you're actually giving the joint more time before, like, then the muscles can react. But if you hit that barrier right away and there's nothing left, like, the only place, like, you have to fall. Yeah. So if you can expand that time frame, you actually can, you might just catch yourself. But if you don't have the ability to slow things down, you're going to basically go straight to the ground, or you're going to have an injury, if you will.
Yeah, because you're just trying to decrease the amount of force that's going into. So if we increase the time, we're essentially going to decrease the amount of force that's going into something.
Yeah. So if you think about it, like, if you increase the time, the force actually could be the same, but because it's spread out over a longer period of time, the overall intensity or magnitude is lower. Or we can decrease the force. So it's one of those things that giving yourself more time, giving yourself more braking, if you will, as far as like stopping the motion, that's going to give you a recipe for success as far as like minimizing the fall risk, if you will.
Yeah, and maybe some people have heard of this. It's like there's a study that shows that correlates grip strength to how long you're going to live.
Yep.
I guess I think the idea is that is just if you have good grip strength, you can then kind of mitigate falls by
catching yourself.
Catch yourself,
yeah.
And essentially, if nothing else, just slowing your descent.
Yeah, just imagine if you're going down a set of stairs and your feet go out from under you for whatever particular reason. If you catch the handrail, but you don't have the grip strength to actually, and it just fails, so then obviously there could be some additional injury that way. But if you have the ability to catch yourself, you might sprain an ankle, or you might stub a toe or something, but it's not going to be nearly as bad as if you didn't catch yourself.
And I think what people don't really understand is like the ability of grip strength is really just your ability to hold and maintain stiffness, which ultimately kind of comes down to kind of connective tissue.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's one of those things. Like, so then the question is, so like, how do I train grip strength? So just because grip strength has shown to be a correlate to longevity doesn't mean that you just go get some grip trainers and you start training your grip. The study actually looked at like people that just do more physical activity. They use their hands, they use their upper body. So it's not necessarily the fact that they had stronger grip per se. It was what they did in their life that allowed them to be strong in their grip. And then that was a marker of long-term
And I
success.
think what kind of it comes down to is just like when you're doing that, you're ultimately holding whatever it is you're doing for longer periods of time. You're
Yeah,
doing this longer, essentially isometric work, and you're not just squeezing
correct. So
a spring.
just imagine if you're doing like a farmer's carry, or just imagine you went to the grocery store and you're like, oh, I've got 15 bags of groceries. I only want to make one trip. I'm just gonna grab them all, between both hands and carry them in. So it's like that sustained grip. You now got to walk from the driveway all the way into the kitchen, or if you're in the gym and you're doing a farmer's carry and you're trying to, you know, can I, like, that's actually a metric. Um, so for an average male in their 40s, they should be able to, um, depending on what you're looking at, 75% body weight between both hands for 2 minutes, or 100% body weight between both hands for 1 minute. Women are a little bit less. So women are 75% for 1 minute. And then it's like 60-ish% if they're going to go for 2 minutes. So anyway, that's a potential like training apparatus, if you will, to help kind of look at some of these things.
Yeah, and because you're holding it, you're not actually moving the muscles.
Right.
It's biasing connective tissue.
Right. So whenever we contract a muscle against an isometric force, basically, and the muscle or the joint isn't really moving, that force has to go somewhere, so it kind of spills over or bleeds into the connective tissue. So it's essentially, we go from loading the muscle to actually using the muscle contraction to load the connective tissue.
Exactly. Um, so connective tissue. Uh, Also now, as we decline, we also see a decline in uh, the amount of fast twitch muscles we have, or density. Or,
Yeah. So if you think of, again, going back to the falls, we need that force absorption. We need that.
so yeah, I think the connective tissue kind of helps prevent us from going to the ground. Getting off the ground is kind of maybe a thing of way to look at it as maintaining our fast twitch muscle fibers.
Yeah. So if you think of someone in their 80s, or later in their life, getting up off the toilet, getting out of a chair is actually a fast twitch event. They need that muscular power to be able, to get up from that seated position. So, you know, we typically don't think of that as a fast twitch event, but as we age, as we decline, um, that is something that we're.
I mean, yeah, if you can't get off the ground, it's why would you go to nursing homes?
Yeah. So independence.
Yeah.
We you have to be able to get off the toilet. You have to be able to get in and out of a chair. Otherwise, you're basically you need to be in some sort of assisted living. So yeah.
Okay, so fast twitch. Let's look at that.
Yeah. So if we're looking at fast twitch, I think that this is where we need, and it's going to be relative, but this is where we need heavy strength training. We're going to get some bone density out of this, because swimming, biking, even jogging or running aren't heavy enough to really stimulate bone density. So if we're going to improve bone density, it has to be load bearing, and heavy strength training is kind of the name of the game. So for fast twitch and or bone density too.
Yeah, so you kind of like with going heavier, because strength is kind of it can be one of the later things to leave us, because speed's going to drop off usually first.
Yes.
So you can train fast twitch through speed, but like I said, that's typically going to drop off sooner. But we can keep it heavy, and then we also get kind of the added benefit of this increasing bone density.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of people, especially as they age, they become afraid of heavy strength training. And it can be just as safe as anything else. So,
Well,
so
I think that's probably just because, like, I mean, as you get older, I mean, you get sore a lot more often. I think your recovery's not as quick as it once was, but it's like that's probably, I mean, especially now, it's probably because training connective tissue has just been, and where injuries happen to the connective tissue level. And so up until really kind of now, it's
yep.
just, I think it's been avoided because of these increased injuries because of poor quality connective tissue.
Yeah, definitely. I would 100% agree. Um, but I think that, like I said, heavy is relative. So, if you're a 25-year-old athlete, heavy is going to be different than if you're 85. And so it's got to be specific to the individual. And so we can't just come up with a generic, oh, everyone should be doing this. It's like, and this kind of goes back to that back casting or looking forward, oh, what do I want to be able to do? So, if you want to be able to pick up, 60 pounds whenever you're 80, you need to be able to at least pick up, 135 whenever you're 40. Like
Yeah,
because you're going to lose muscle mass over time. So what you're doing whenever you're 40 isn't going to be the same as 80, but we have to like correlate like what we're trying to achieve whenever we're 80 to make sure that what we're doing now is enough.
yeah. Like if you want to be able to lift your grandkid, lift your grandkid up,
Yeah.
you probably we should, starting. It'd be a lot easier to start a lot earlier
Yes.
because there is going to be that decline in muscle mass as we get older.
Yeah, I think, after the age of 40, I think it's like 15% per decade. So, it's definitely significant, right?
Yeah,
And so the goal, like we said earlier, is to try to like minimize the steepness of the slope. So we're trying to just keep it as flat as possible, even though we know that there's going to be a little bit of a decline.
yeah. Uh,
So as far as like fast twitch, um, I would say minimum is going to be 2 days a week. You probably could be looking at 3 to 4 days a week, but definitely 2 days a week. And you probably need to be spending kind of that 45 minutes, almost to an hour each session. And this should be a well-rounded program. So if you think of like the five kind of push pull hinge twist, locomotive, like the general kind of things that you would do in a gym. Like you don't want to overly focus on one particular thing. You want to keep it relatively general. You want to be hitting, you know, multiple muscle groups, kind of compound movements, like trying to kind of hit all body parts in both sessions. I mean, you could split it up into upper body, lower body, but I think for the average person, just kind of targeting a full body session 2 days a week, I think would be a good place to start.
yeah, and we kind of talked about how it's relative. So as far as like an intensity, where do you want to be at as far as a relative intensity?
Yeah, I think, if you're just starting out, the intensity might be a little different, but I think that, since we are talking about fast twitch, it needs to be, we talked about heavy, so it needs to be 80, 90%. And if you don't know what your, true 1 rep max is, that's fine. You can estimate based on 3 or 5 reps, that sort of thing. There's charts out there. But I think doing fewer reps at a higher intensity is really what we're looking at.
Yeah.
Rather, I mean, again, if you're brand new, doing more reps at a lower weight is probably a good place to start, but the goal should be fewer reps at a higher intensity. I think that's really what we're striving for.
Agreed. Um, okay, so maintaining strength. Kind of covered that. Also, now our next kind of pillar, kind of what I want to talk about is kind of like stability and mobility.
Yep.
Uh, First off, let's kind of difference between stability and mobility.
So, and we'll even throw in flexibility. So,
Okay.
flexibility is basically the joint's passive range of motion. So, if an outside force, so say like if I take your arm and I move your arm through, a range of motion, that's what the joint has the ability to do. But mobility is like the active component of that quote unquote flexibility. So control in the presence of change. So you're trying to be able to control the joint through a range of motion. Um, and then stability is the ability to kind of like, it's not necessarily rigidity. I think a lot of times people think of like just not moving, but it's controlling the movement to a little bit greater degree. So if you think of like a suspension bridge, right? Um, the bridge isn't completely rigid. It has the ability to move a little bit.
With you.
So those cables, they provide stability. Like if you didn't have enough of those cables, the bridge would be all over the place. So depending on the length of the bridge, you've got to have enough suspension components to be able to kind of like keep it so the bridge isn't all over the place. So we have connective tissue components, we have muscular components that, and then obviously the neurological component that controls the range of motion through all of these different subsystems, if you will.
So yeah, maybe like, do I have the flexibility to get my arm overhead? Do I have the mobility to actually get that weight overhead? And then do I have the stability to be able to kind of control it and support it overhead?
Correct. And then from there, then what we just talked about, then you can start to build strength, and then strength, endurance, speed, strength, like all of those things on top of it. But if you don't have the flexibility, so if you can't lift your arm overhead, well, doing an overhead press isn't really feasible. So first you have to have the flexibility, then you need the active control, then you need the stability, and like it's a foundational kind of, it just builds on itself. Then you can start to build, muscular strength, power, endurance, those types of things.
Yeah. Uh,
But I think, everyone probably has their own version of this. As we age, people just assume that we lose range of motion. But what we really know is people stop doing certain things or they do less of certain things. And so, you are what you repeatedly do. So when's the last time you've reached overhead? And if you can say, oh, it's been a couple of years, like you've probably lost that range of motion to a certain extent. And so range of motion is something that we have to continually practice, almost, if you will. We have to like tell the nervous system that we want to be able to be in this position. So this goes back to the use it or lose it concept.
So you're telling me if you don't use it, you'll lose it?
Yes. Yeah, it's a cliche kind of term, but it's a biological truth, really. So goes back to the efficiency concept. It's expensive to maintain the health of the joint across the entire joint. So if you aren't using a particular part of the joint, the body says, well, let's just eliminate using that. So there's limitations in like that aspect. So it's like, okay, well, we do a lot here, so we're going to maintain that health, but we're not going to send any nutrients or any kind of neurological input to the posterior aspect. And so eventually the body just says, let's just make that some sort of less demanding tissue. And so it just creates this kind of dense connective tissue that really has a low metabolic yield or necessity. And so then you lose the ability to produce force, you lose the ability to produce strength.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of underlooked as far as how important mobility is as far as we're aging because I mean, as we get older, we know there's a decline in a lot of different things.
Yep.
Uh, so if we maybe post another a graph on here, so we have this that force length curve.
Correct. Yes.
We have this kind of natural bell curve. So kind of at our in ranges, we have lower amount of force capability.
Right.
And as we get age, maybe a little bit of cognitive decline, balance coordination also kind of drops off. Our neurological system isn't quite as sharp as it once was.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to fault. We're going to step outside. We're going to slip. We're going to fall. So then
Mm-hmm.
having more active control, more force producing tissue kind of at those end ranges when we kind of step outside of what we're kind of normally doing in our everyday life, we have that force producing or force absorbing tissue uh, there so that we don't actually injure ourselves. Because whenever, as we said before, that capacity is greater than the load bearing capacity or the absorbing capacity of that tissue, the tissue is going to injure.
Yeah. So if you look at that bell curve and those ends are pretty low and the middle is high, everyone does pretty well. Now we might start to see a little bit of a narrowing of that, and obviously the bell is going to lower as well. But the more we can maintain those end ranges, again, the less likely that we're going to have a catastrophic injury. It doesn't mean that we might not have a strain here or there, but we're not going to see this like rotator cuff tear or some sort of you know injury that requires a surgical intervention.
Yeah. Uh,
So maintaining the health of the joint through end range loading, so taking the joint to that particular end range and then trying to produce some force in those positions helps to maintain the quality throughout the entire joint rather than if we're just bench pressing, that's going to be a very narrow slice of what the joint can produce.
yeah. So kind of more into like FRS, but this is kind of what we say like well maybe a different way of applying this term that we've heard is kind of like living on Pales Island.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like just like a good overall maintenance for keeping some more baseline in range strength is just
Right.
kind of doing these more isometric loading at length.
Correct. Yeah. So we talked about that in fall prevention type stuff, but it's exactly how you would maintain the health of connective tissue anywhere. So um, if we're trying to maintain those end ranges, you have to actually train at those end ranges. And the funny thing is, like if you think of any gym exercise, where do we lose the ability to produce force? It's at those end ranges. So say you're doing a bicep curl, you're really good in the middle, but as soon as you get to that long length, it's like, oh, it's tough. And as soon as you get to the
Yeah, what do you see when as you're starting to hit kind of failure on those? Well, we'll take bicep curls since you brought it. We see that back extension.
yeah, so you're going to start to compensate. You're going to start to substitute, and bicep curls or whatever. But if we take that to a sporting event, we go to shoulder, and it's like if you don't have the ability to put your shoulder over your head and you're trying to push a barbell overhead, you go into that lumbar extension. We might start to see some injuries or low back pain if we're overloading that too much.
Yeah. So yeah, don't sleep on mobility.
Yeah, maintaining the health of the joints is really if we're looking at this longevity piece, you can't do aerobic activity, you can't train strength if you don't have the ability for the joint to do it.
Yeah.
So if we were trying to really like the joints have to be able to do it first. And so if we were really going to prioritize, maintaining the health of the joint is really utmost importance.
You can't move where you can't move.
Exactly.
Okay, so yeah, from a longevity standpoint, anything else we kind of want to talk about? I know as we reach a certain age, we're gonna start to see a steady decline. It's just
Hmm. Yeah, we've talked about that 15% kind of per decade. So it starts to kind of fall up, and then it compounds as we get older.
So kind of having like an in range, like if we're planning for retirement, it's like we know we have this, we want to live a certain lifestyle,
Hmm.
from a monetary standpoint. If we, from a physical standpoint, if we know we want to be able to, you know, play soccer with our grandkids in the backyard when
Right.
they're growing up, we need to kind of have this endpoint mindset, and then we need
Yeah.
to kind of apply that and bring it to kind of where we're at now to kind of plan for that.
Yeah. So really, that you've got to sit down with yourself or with your family or whatever, and like I can't make the list for you. Like you've got to what's important to you. If you're a golfer, pickleball, the gym is your thing. Doesn't matter. Like you have to decide what's important, and then you have to decide, okay, what do I want to be able to do? Do you like to travel? Do you like? I don't know. And so you've got to come up with your list, and then from that list, this is where like people like us like actually come into play. So it's like you might not know how to structure this for yourself. So if you come up with your list, then you need someone to help guide you through this process. And it doesn't mean that you have to be seeing someone every single week, but having someone to help guide you through some of these training components, I think is really beneficial because, we've talked about all this connective tissue stuff. Um, you can search the internet and you're going to find varying opinions, but having someone that does this on a daily basis to really kind of like cut through the chatter and really get to like what's important, I think is important. So first off, assessing like what's important, figuring out what you want to be able to do in your last decade, and then finding someone that can help you either craft a plan or come up with a strategy on like how do I start to implement some of this
Yeah,
stuff.
and I don't think sometimes you might be capable. Some people might be capable of that, but just I mean, sadly, it's just not really taught.
No,
It's
none of this stuff
growing up. Like,
is commonly held knowledge. Like, yes, we have all this training knowledge, but it's not packaged in this particular way. So yeah, I definitely think that the body didn't come with a training manual, and so we we need some help in determining because if you just go get some generic program, I like to think we talked about this the other day. I think people they feel like they're putting effort into particular areas, but really like they they're either staying the same or they're actually declining even though they're working out or they're doing all this stuff. It's like they don't realize that they're putting their effort in the wrong thing.
yeah, so you've mentioned before, you can be intentional going to the gym and spending that time on the treadmill, or you can just kind of go through the motions and.
Right.
And I guess something's better than nothing at the very bare minimum. But uh, if you have an end in mind and how you want to live
Mm-hmm.
in that last decade,
Yep.
we need to be intentional now.
Right. So if you're looking at this from a kind of like a structural standpoint, we talked a lot about, and I think like we said we're going to do this, a full episode. That mitochondrial health is kind of like the basis of our energy production and energy utilization. So that's really the foundation. We talked about connective tissue and joint health. Like if you can't move, then you can't move into areas where you can't move. So it's like you have to have the ability to utilize the ranges of motion in the tissues. So it's like those are really the foundations, and then everything kind of like builds off of those things.
Yeah. Can I maybe just reiterate?
Mm-hmm.
So zone two, kind of 1.5 hours a week, kind of at that 65-ish% intensity.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start, and it doesn't mean that as you get more efficient or as like so unfortunately what happens is like as you get more efficient it comes into like one of two things. You either have to do more sessions per week, or you wind up having to do longer sessions.
Yeah.
In the beginning, I think, like if you, I know we didn't necessarily lay it out in one kind of, but the minimum effective dose is about 3 hours per week in each of these four categories. So like the mobility stability, that's like 10 to 15 minutes a day. You've got your, zone 2, that's at least 45 minutes twice a week. You've got your strength, which is basically like 2 hours per week. And then, you've got your,
Mobility.
you've got your, not mitochondria. We've got the actual VO2. So that's another hour.
Yeah.
So whenever you put it all together, it winds up being about 3-ish hours as like what we need to be shooting for the minimal dose of this whole kind of plan.
Yeah, and like I said, that's kind of a minimum. If you have higher goals and larger expectations for your future, then yeah, you're going to spend a little bit more.
Yeah,
time.
and so if you really want to take this to like optimal, you're probably looking at 10 to 12 hours per week, and then whenever you're like, well, I can't devote any more time, then it's like you have to make sure that you're not wasting time whenever you're at the gym. So your warm up has to be dedicated and efficient. Your training has to be spot on so that you can get the most out of the time spent in the gym. Whereas, you're not going to go talk at the water cooler for, 15, 20 minutes, and you're going to kind of do some, soft warm up, and like you need to be intentional about your time to get the most out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else?
I mean, we can keep going if you want, but yeah, I think that we've covered it all. We might not have talked about a lot, but there's a lot of positive brain health, positive mental aspects to physical exertion. So there's more to it than just like the physical side. There's also kind of that cognitive brain health.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that's kind of gets back to that. Whenever we see these kind of people retire, we know a lot of people, we've seen a lot of people, heard of people that just kind of instantly drop off. It's as humans, we're meant to overcome both mental and physical challenges, and we have this reward system built into us to kind of to keep ourselves healthy and to keep ourselves active in doing that. Because like I said, we kind of live in a world we weren't meant to be in. So if we couldn't, go find food 2,000 years ago, we died. If we don't have the movement or the tissue capabilities to do that.
Exactly. So, that 15% decline is coming whether you like it or not. There's no way around it. So you got to start now to implement some of these things. Otherwise, it's going to hit you faster than you realize. And you're going to wish, because everyone wishes they had more time. Once something, big starts to, change the trajectory of their life. So it's like, well, you've got to start devoting, small amounts of time now so that you actually have more time later. Steve Jobs, he died at the age of 56, I believe. He had $9 billion in the bank.
Yeah.
And it's like, what good is all that money if you didn't have the longevity, even normal lifespan? He should have still had 20 plus more years to live his life, to see his grandkids. But he wound up dying way earlier than maybe he should have. But that kind of goes back to that poor environment, being around technology all the time, right?
Yeah. So I guess no matter what, like, start today, start as soon as you can. Like I said, yeah, because it's only going downhill.
Your body will thank you whether you like it or not.
Yeah. If you found this helpful, please like or subscribe. If you didn't find it helpful, please still like or subscribe. yeah, and we'll go into more details on some of these topics specifically here in the future. So stay tuned, and we'll catch you next time.
See you again soon.